Hello, my name is Marshall. I am the author of Dead End Guildmaster, currently on Royal Road, releasing 2 chapters per week. If you're supporting that already, thank you so much. I really appreciate you. So every week, because I like writing and I want to talk about writing, I do a quick little video on some aspect of the creative writing process and really dig into my perspective on it. This is just my opinion, my take on things, my interpretation. So there's a lot of ways to look at this, and mine's not necessarily right. So you now have that disclaimer. Today, we're going to look at the shapes of stories, which is another way of saying structure. But I think when I say structure, a lot of people think of a traditional outline or a typical linear outline, and that's useful. But thinking of our stories as having more physical shapes, it can reveal some interesting opportunities for us. So we're going to dig into what that means here in just a second. And as a new thing, I'm also going to share what I'm reading. So I just finished Bog Isekai by Miles English, book 2. I loved book 1, absolutely adored it. Book 2 was a lot of fun as well. I'm currently reading Mark of the Fool 8 by J.M. Clark. As you probably guessed, I've read books 1 through 7. I'll let you know how I feel about that one. I'm having fun so far. And then I want to do a reread of Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut, because we talk about Kurt Vonnegut a lot in today's video, and that's made me nostalgic. So I want to reread that book. Okay, shapes of stories. So we're talking about the structure, the major opportunities besides clarity, besides the reader understanding what we want them to understand. Let's go ahead and put clarity in here too. I can't type. Okay, so now clarity's on there. So clarity always matters. But the big opportunities in being more critical and mindful of story structure come in the form of pacing, the way we build tension, and the payoff that we get from making those tense moments. So what's the resolution or the outcome that we've been building up to? And these are all different types of narrative opportunities. But I separate these out as different things because every story that you write is going to have these exact same opportunities in it. How you approach them will be different, but the outcome that you get by thinking critically about story structure and the shape of your stories is always going to fall into these 4 buckets, is always going to include that to some degree. Whereas narrative opportunities is much more about style and preference. Obviously that matters for everything, but narrative opportunities, the one that I pursue might be very different from what you pursue. And that could even be if we're telling the same story, just because of the way we interpret the world and the way we regurgitate what we've interpreted back into the world. So you probably saw this in English class. I used to teach composition once upon a time at the college level. So these are from old PowerPoint slides that I no longer have the original files for. So that's why they're all janky. So please forgive 23-year-old Marshall's sense of style here. But yeah, Grandma's Plot Triangle. You've heard of this. It's high school English class stuff. If you haven't, this is the basic format. So the idea is most stories start with an introduction. Then we have some sort of rising action or problem that's growing or becoming more important. Then we hit the climax, which is where all of that comes to a head and we have some sort of outcome or resolution. And then our falling action is us coming back down from all the tension we just built and released here. So this usually ends up being like wrap up, post conclusion, epilogue-ish sort of content. You've seen this before, and I think it being so commonly taught can turn into it seeming dated and not useful. I disagree. So if you take a story and use the plot triangle as a way to revise it or as a way to better analyze how a story works or how it's working currently, you can do some pretty cool things by knowing that this is the basic structure of a story. So for example, last week we talked about types of sentences and we used an In Cold Blood excerpt as an example. So if I take that same chunk of writing that we looked at last week, which is like roughly the first 12 pages or so of the book, and we map it out topic by topic, point by point, we start to get a plot triangle shape, which I think is really interesting and also very useful, because then we can better understand pacing when we look at this. So the story starts, we have a description of Kansas, zoom into the town where these murders happened. Then we hear that murders happened. That's like, oh boy, that's I'm curious about murders in this really small town. But then we kind of leave that simmer and spend a good chunk of time in this stretch here characterizing the clutters. So introducing the family that gets killed and connecting the reader to them in a more intimate way. And that's the tension's there, but it's not increased from what we've spiked here as soon as we realize that murders are going to happen in this place, and we're probably figuring out that it's going to happen to the clutters. But then at the end of that chunk, we reveal that Mr. Clutter is going to die soon, which puts us back into this spike of tension. So the reason I think this is interesting and how it can be useful in revision is if you map a story out and your story is nothing but conflict increasing, then you probably want to work in some beats where the reader can take a breather and the understanding of the story develops more than the specific plot points are developing. So like instead of moving on to the next problem, spending more time on the current problem, that sort of thing. And this sort of diagramming of our work helps do that, can make that easier. Again, just a tool. Might not necessarily be what works for you, but it is useful for me. But if we go farther, because this is where I stole the idea of shapes of stories from, is Kurt Vonnegut. One of his college, I think it was his thesis actually. But anyways, the way he maps out the shapes of stories is pretty interesting because he does the opposite of the plot triangle. But it still accomplishes the same thing. It uses the diagram, the physical representation, or the visual representation rather, of your story to understand how it works and maybe how it should be working if it's not working that way right now. So the way he breaks it down, we'll start with his man in the hole one. I'm not going to make you go through all of these. I got the source in here and in the description. But the way Vonnegut set this up, anything positive is happening above this middle line. So he has an x-axis and a y-axis that represent conflict and represent the nature of what characters are experiencing. So instead of building tension, we are understanding that we're trying to get back or achieve a new height of some sort. I just think it's interesting to reverse it and think instead of thinking about tension going up, thinking about the character being deeper and deeper in trouble. That might help you unlock some other ways of thinking about your story. Because if you're not deep enough, then you probably want to add more elements and layers to the problem. But if you're too deep, you might want to simplify. So this story structure, again, can be very useful for how you put together your narrative. You don't have to follow a template necessarily, but understanding some of the broad formats can let you skip a lot of second guessing and a lot of revision. All that's to say, this is basic story structure put in a linear way. And I mentioned earlier that linear outlines might not be as useful or are a different kind of use than the structure shapes that we're looking at now. So I want to take a second and also look at the usefulness of linear structure and representing your story that way. So this outline here, one is where the story starts in the chronological narrative. This is where the story starts in the actual narrative. So this is your classic start at the end and then build up and show us how we got there. And then this one is probably going to be a lot more common for what we read in the lit RPG genre, especially. Most of those stories end up being relatively linear chronologically, but a lot of them incorporate flashbacks. So this particular outline is us flashing back to the same scene over and over. So usually if we have something super dramatic tension that's starting at the very beginning of this, we're probably going to bounce back to it and keep developing that as the story goes on. Or these could just be flashbacks to various points in the characters' lives so we learn more about who they are and what's made them this way. One flag that one of my favorite uses in, I would call it progression fantasy, is in The Murder of Crows by Chris Talbane. This is a fun series. It's about post-apocalyptic superheroes. But it's a trilogy, and the trilogy starts at the end. And I thought that was a pretty bold move to make, because that payoff is 3 books away when you decide to do that in book 1. And I thought it was really well handled, and it turns into a pretty interesting narrative device. So if you haven't read it, I definitely recommend that book as well. And then I'll be back next week with more creative writing stuff. If you have requests or suggestions, I'd be happy to hear them. So drop them in the comments.